The wind cut across the barren ridge like a sharpened blade, carrying with it dust, echoes, and the unshakable reminder of how unforgiving this battlefield truly was. A young woman named Alligator knelt low, her knees sinking slightly into the coarse gravel beneath her as her fingers carefully ran along the length of the massive rifle sprawled before her. She had been issued the weapon only 3 days ago, and already the veterans around her whispered half-mocking, half-worried comments about how such a rookie had no business with something as monstrous as the Snipex Alligator, a rifle that looked less like a firearm and more like a mechanical beast designed to devour anything foolish enough to stand in its path. It was the kind of weapon that men with graying temples and 20 years of war under their belts sometimes hesitated to use, for it was heavy, unpredictable, and punishing to the shoulder of anyone reckless enough to fire it without preparation. And yet, here she was, adjusting her sights, tightening her grip, her chest rising and falling with steady rhythm as she fought to control the anxious electricity coursing through her veins. The assignment had come abruptly, almost brutally. Her unit had been ambushed 2 days earlier during what was supposed to be a simple patrol through the valley. Outnumbered, outgunned, they had retreated and taken shelter in the ridges, and now their command had tasked someone with covering their escape route until reinforcements could arrive. The veterans had argued about who would take the responsibility, names tossed back and forth like grenades with pins pulled, until the captain's sharp voice had cut them all down, declaring that the Alligator would go to the rookie. Alligator still remembered the silence that had followed, the disbelief that clung to the air, the smirks and muttered curses as the older soldiers shook their heads. To them, she was just a name on a roster, a girl with no scars, no blood on her hands, someone who still polished her boots every night like it mattered. But the captain had looked her dead in the eye, saw something the others didn't, and without flinching had strapped the Snipex case to her shoulders and ordered her to climb to the ridge. Now, with the sun sinking low and the shadows growing long, she understood what it meant to carry not just the rifle but the weight of expectation, of survival, of the chance that her single action could mean life or death for everyone still huddled behind broken rocks and fractured walls below. She pressed her cheek to the cold metal of the scope, her eye aligning with the crosshairs, and the world beyond blurred into a tunnel of dust, distance, and waiting targets. Through the magnification she could see the enemy. They were far, so far that to most shooters they would appear no larger than moving dots. But through her lens she could make out their outlines, their movements, the way they crept along the ridge opposite hers with careful confidence. They thought they were out of range, safe to maneuver without the fear of death. No ordinary rifle could reach them at that distance, not with accuracy, not with power. But the Alligator was no ordinary rifle. It was a beast built for impossible shots, its enormous chamber capable of launching projectiles across kilometers with a force that ignored reason. Still, knowing the rifle could do it was one thing. Believing that she, a rookie who had never fired at such range under combat conditions, could harness that power was another. Her finger rested lightly against the trigger, not pressing, just there, reminding her that the final decision was hers alone. She thought of her training, the endless hours of breathing drills, of adjusting for wind, of calculating trajectories on paper while instructors barked corrections over her shoulder. She thought of the captain's eyes, steady and unyielding as if daring her to prove him wrong. And she thought of the soldiers behind her, veterans who had mocked her, who had laughed under their breath, who now relied on her in ways they could never admit. Her heart thundered inside her chest, but her breathing slowed, her hands steadied, and the noise of the world dimmed until all she heard was the wind and the soft mechanical groan of the scope as she adjusted for distance. The rangefinder flickered with data, 3,600, 3,700 meters. The number felt absurd, impossible, and yet the enemy kept moving, unaware that in the crosshairs of a rookie's scope, death was already deciding how close it wanted to stand. The veterans below had grown silent, their eyes fixed on her silhouette against the fading sky. They didn't speak, didn't mock, didn't dare interrupt. Something in her stillness had frozen them too, some recognition that this moment was teetering on the edge of legend or disaster. If she failed, it would confirm everything they thought of her, a child pretending to play in a war where men bled and died. But if she succeeded, if she truly made the shot, then every scarred veteran would have to swallow their doubts and admit that war sometimes chose its champions in the most unlikely forms. She inhaled, exhaled, and let the rhythm of her body merge with the rhythm of the wind. Her finger tightened, the trigger groaned, and in that instant before the shot broke the silence, she felt the weight of the world collapse into the tunnel of her scope, into the heartbeat pounding in her ears, into the single frozen second that decided everything. The roar of the rifle split the air like a thunderclap, echoing through the ridges and valleys with a force that rattled even the stones beneath her knees. the recoil slamming hard into Elira's shoulder and jolting her entire body backward, but she held her ground, gritting her teeth as the Snipex Alligator released its monstrous fury. Through the scope she watched the projectile cut across the impossible distance, a streak too fast for the eye to follow, and then, almost unreal, she saw the tiny silhouette of the enemy figure collapse mid-step, folding like a puppet with its strings severed, and the silence that followed was deafening, an unnatural pause in the chaos of war, as if the very battlefield itself was stunned into disbelief at what had just occurred. 3,700 meters away, a life had ended at the hands of a rookie who was never supposed to succeed. For a moment Elira couldn't move, her breath caught between exhilaration and terror, her fingers still curled around the trigger, her cheek pressed to the metal, her mind replaying the impossible shot over and over as if she needed proof that she had truly done it. Below, the veterans who had once sneered and doubted her stood frozen, their eyes locked on her as though she had transformed into something else entirely, no longer the girl polishing boots and stammering through orders, but a weapon, a soldier, perhaps even a legend being carved before their eyes. Then the murmurs began, disbelieving whispers carried by the wind. "Did you see that? It's not possible. She actually hit it." Some even muttered prayers as though divine intervention had guided the bullet, while others shook their heads in awe, realizing that no god had been behind it, only the steady hand of the rookie they had mocked. But the battlefield offered no time for celebration, for even as the first target fell, the enemy began to stir, confusion rippling through their ranks as they pointed, shouted, scrambled into defensive positions, unable to comprehend where death had come from or how their supposed safe distance had been violated. Elira forced herself to breathe again, to push past the trembling in her hands, to realign her sights on the next target. The Alligator was heavy, unforgiving, and each shot would take its toll on her body, but she knew that as long as she held this ridge, her comrades below had a chance to escape, and that thought hardened her resolve. She remembered the captain's words, soft but unyielding: "War doesn't wait for permission. Either you rise to meet it, or it buries you where you stand." She had thought those words harsh at the time, cruel even, but now she understood their meaning as clearly as she understood the wind direction or the curvature of the earth beneath her bullet's path. The second shot thundered, rattling her teeth, bruising her shoulder deeper, and again the scope revealed another enemy soldier falling backward, their weapon tumbling from lifeless fingers. Panic erupted among the rest, some scattering, others trying to rush forward in a blind attempt to locate the phantom sniper, their movements betraying their fear. Each pull of the trigger drained her strength but also ignited something fierce inside her, something that had been dormant, waiting, hidden even from herself. A steadiness, a ruthless clarity that allowed her to track their frantic movements and calculate the timing with a calmness that shocked her as much as it terrified her. She had always imagined war as chaos, noise, blood, and fear, but in her scope it became something else, something cold and precise, a world where every breath and every fraction of a second determined fate. Below, the veterans had stopped whispering and now moved with renewed vigor, emboldened by the knowledge that the ridge above was guarded by a hand they no longer dared underestimate, their retreat transforming from a desperate scramble into an organized withdrawal as they covered one another and moved toward the extraction point. But the enemy was relentless, their numbers greater, their anger mounting with every fallen comrade, and soon heavy machine guns were being set up across the ridge opposite hers, their barrels glinting in the fading sun as they prepared to saturate the valley with fire. Elira's pulse quickened, her lips pressed into a firm line as she adjusted her scope, knowing she had seconds before those guns tore her position apart. She breathed in, felt the rhythm of the wind again, adjusted her angle by mere millimeters, and when she exhaled, the third shot roared like thunder from the heavens. The recoil nearly knocked her flat, pain screaming through her shoulder, but through the haze she saw the enemy gunner collapse onto the weapon before he could fire, his crew scattering in panic as the massive machine gun fell silent before it had even begun. A cheer rose faintly from the veterans below, raw and unfiltered, but Elira barely heard it, her world shrinking further into the scope, into the next target, into the battle that demanded everything she had and offered nothing in return. Sweat trickled down her brow, mixing with dust, her arms ached from holding the rifle steady, yet she refused to falter, for she was no longer just a rookie, no longer just a name on a roster. In this moment she was the line between survival and annihilation, and as long as she could breathe, as long as she could see, she would keep firing, no matter the cost. The rhythm of war had shifted, and Elira could feel it in the trembling of the rifle beneath her cheek, in the pounding of her heart against her ribs, in the way the enemy no longer advanced with the same arrogance as before but instead hesitated, wary, cautious, trying to comprehend how a sniper so far away could dismantle them piece by piece. she adjusted her position slightly, her muscles sore, her shoulders screaming from the recoil of the previous shots, but she refused to give it rest. For rest was a luxury she could not afford when her comrade's survival still depended on the thunder in her hands, the thunder that shook mountains and bent the will of men who thought themselves untouchable. The dust across the valley began to thicken as enemy mortars were rolled into position, their crews moving with urgency, and Alira's breath caught at the sight of them, for she knew that if even one shell landed near her allies, the withdrawal would turn into a slaughter. Her finger found the trigger again, but she hesitated, not out of fear but calculation, for the distance was even greater than before, the targets moving erratically as they set up their launchers, and the margin for error was so small it bordered on absurdity. Yet something inside her, something that had awakened the moment the first target fell, told her this was possible, told her that the impossible was now her reality, and so she steadied her hands, adjusted for the shifting wind, and let the world collapse once more into the tunnel of her scope. She fired. The sound cracked through the air, echoing like judgment itself, and the recoil sent another bolt of pain through her body, but through the lens she saw one of the mortar crews fall, his hands clawing at nothing as he toppled into the dust, and the others scrambled, abandoning their position in fear of the ghostly hand that reached across miles to pluck them from existence. The veterans below shouted encouragement now, their disbelief replaced with something raw and electric, as if they had been given a glimpse of hope they hadn't dared to dream of, and Alira felt their voices strengthening her resolve, weaving into her very bones, steadying her against the fatigue gnawing at her arms. But the enemy wasn't finished. They adapted quickly, their commanders barking orders, their vehicles shifting into cover, and soon armored transports began crawling across the far ridge, their thick plates meant to laugh at ordinary bullets, their turrets swiveling like hungry predators searching for prey. For a moment, a flicker of doubt pierced her chest. What good was a rifle, even one as monstrous as the Alligator, against rolling walls of steel? She forced the doubt down, forced herself to remember that legends weren't born by hesitating at the sight of obstacles, they were forged by shattering them, and so she narrowed her gaze, letting her crosshairs hover over a transport's exposed viewport, a fragile weakness amidst the iron skin. She exhaled, slow and steady, and squeezed. The rifle bucked savagely, nearly tearing her from her perch, but the bullet flew true, slicing through the glass and exploding inside the cabin, fire blooming as the transport lurched, shuddered, and then went still, smoke curling from its frame. The explosion sent a ripple of chaos through the enemy lines, soldiers scattering from the flaming wreck, their morale fracturing in ways no commander could repair quickly, and Alira seized the moment, realigning her sights, already searching for the next target, because she knew momentum was everything, that hesitation was death, that she could not let them breathe long enough to recover. Another shot, another transport crippled, its wheels buckling beneath the force, another reminder to the enemy that their armor was meaningless when a single rookie with a monstrous rifle could reduce them to wreckage. Pain gnawed at her body now, her shoulder bruised to the bone, her arms trembling under the weight of the weapon, her breath coming in ragged pulls, but still she pressed on, her will burning hotter than her exhaustion, her spirit refusing to yield. Below, her comrades were nearly clear of the valley, the veterans guiding the wounded, carrying the fallen, their voices carrying upward as they called her name, not mockingly this time, not with derision, but with something that sounded dangerously close to reverence. It struck her like a strange kind of fire, both warming and terrifying, because she had never wanted to be revered, never sought glory, only survival, only the chance to prove to herself that she belonged here. Yet fate had thrust her into this place, into this impossible role, and she had answered with thunder and steel. The enemy, desperate now, unleashed their fury in return. Tracers lit the air, sweeping across the ridge, hammering the rocks around her, and explosions tore at the ground, showering her with dirt and fragments as she rolled to adjust her angle, narrowly avoiding the death that clawed at her position. The scope was smeared with dust, her vision blurred by smoke and sweat, but she wiped it clean with the back of her glove, set her cheek to the stock again and refused to let fear take root. Through the haze she saw them advancing, squads moving under the cover of suppressive fire, trying to close the distance, trying to eliminate the phantom that haunted them. She breathed, aimed, and fired again, each shot a punishing toll on her body but also a promise, a declaration to friend and foe alike that she would not yield this ridge, not now, not ever. With every fallen enemy she felt herself slipping further from the person she had been that morning, further from the rookie they had mocked, and closer to something she could barely recognize, a soldier whose name would echo long after the battle ended. The sun had nearly vanished now, the valley cloaked in twilight, fire and smoke painting the horizon in violent shades of orange and black, and still she fought, her arms trembling, her lungs burning, her body screaming for rest, but her spirit unbroken, her fingers steady, her scope unflinching. The war was not over, not yet, but she had carved a legend into its bones, and as the veterans reached the extraction point, looking back one last time at the rookie who had become their shield, they knew they would never forget this day, this ridge, or the thunder that saved them. The night had fallen fully now, the last traces of sunlight consumed by the horizon, and the battlefield glowed with the flickering light of fires burning in the distance, casting twisted shadows across the rocks. Where Alira lay, her body aching, her shoulder bruised to the point of numbness, her muscles screaming with every movement, but she refused to let go of the rifle, refused to let the fatigue consume her, because the enemy had not given up, and as long as their silhouettes still moved through her scope, she knew her duty was not finished, not while her comrades were still making their way to safety. The ridge that had once felt like an isolated perch now felt like a throne and a coffin all at once, a place where she commanded death with every pull of the trigger but also where death stalked her with every second she lingered, for the enemy had turned their focus entirely toward her, their weapons spitting fire into the night, their commanders desperate to silence the phantom that had shattered their confidence. Each bullet that cracked past her ear, each explosion that shook the ground beneath her, reminded her how fragile her existence was, but she steadied herself, dragging in slow breaths, pressing her bruised cheek against the cold steel of the scope, letting the crosshairs steady her soul when her body threatened to collapse. Through the magnification she saw movement, squads advancing again, not in reckless waves this time but in coordinated lines, using shadows and cover, moving like predators hunting in the dark, their helmets glinting faintly under the firelight, their rifles raised, scanning for the sniper they still could not find. She knew she had only moments before they drew close enough to overwhelm her, and the thought sent a chill through her bones, but then she remembered why she was here, remembered the captain's unflinching eyes, remembered the veterans who had mocked her but now whispered her name like it was a lifeline, and she felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. She shifted her aim, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The Alligator roared again, the recoil slamming her shoulder as if it wanted to tear her apart, but she welcomed the pain because it meant she was still alive, still fighting, and through the scope she watched one of the advancing soldiers crumple into the dust, his comrades stumbling in shock before scattering for cover. The shot gave her away, of course, the muzzle flash cutting through the dark like lightning, and a storm of gunfire erupted in her direction, tearing the rocks around her into shards, showering her with fragments that sliced her skin and left burning trails across her arms and face, but she gritted her teeth, rolled into a new position, and lined up another shot before they could adjust. Another thunderclap, another enemy collapsed, and the squads hesitated again, their confidence faltering with every life she took from the shadows. Her breaths came ragged now, each one tasting of dust and smoke, her eyes stinging from the acrid air, but her focus never wavered, for the scope had become her world, her heartbeat had become the metronome of death, and every pull of the trigger was another verse in the story fate was writing for her. She did not know how many she had killed, did not want to count, for numbers felt meaningless in the chaos of survival, but she knew the ridge was littered with bodies now, and the survivors hesitated, whispering in fear, some even firing blindly into the darkness as if trying to exorcise the ghost that haunted them. Yet even ghosts grow weary, and Alira could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, could feel her body trembling against her will, could feel the bruise in her shoulders swelling with each punishing recoil until the pain was no longer sharp but dull and suffocating, a constant throb that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, forcing her eyes open, forcing herself to remain tethered to the rifle, for she knew that if she faltered now, if she let herself drift even for a second, the enemy would close the distance and all she had fought for would unravel. Below, she could just barely make out the distant shapes of her comrades reaching the extraction point, the last of them pulling back under the cover she had bought with sweat and blood, and that sight gave her strength, for it meant she had not fought in vain, meant that her suffering had carved a path for them to survive. Still, the enemy did not relent, and soon the dull thump of artillery in the distance made her stomach twist, for she knew what was coming, knew that they were preparing to bombard the ridge until nothing remained, knew that she could not withstand such firepower. Her options were gone, stay and die or move and risk being hunted down in the open, but neither choice mattered to her anymore, not when she had already given everything she had to give. She inhaled, her breath shaking, her lips dry, and looked through the scope one last time, watching as the enemy prepared their artillery, their silhouettes framed by the firelight, their voices carrying faintly across the valley like a distant storm. She lined up her sights, adjusted for distance and wind, and pressed the trigger with a steadiness that defied her exhaustion. The Alligator bellowed, and one of the artillery crews fell, chaos erupting as the others scrambled, their weapon momentarily abandoned, and in that chaos she rolled from her perch, dragging the rifle with her, her body weak but her spirit aflame, determined to fight until her last breath. The ridge was no longer safe, the valley no longer hers to command, but she had bought her comrades their survival, had carved her name into the marrow of this night, and though she staggered with every step, though her vision blurred and her body begged for rest, she kept moving, kept fighting, because she was no longer just a rookie, no longer just a girl with polished boots and trembling hands. She was the thunder in the darkness, the phantom in the scope, the legend born in fire and blood. The ridge behind her was burning, torn apart by artillery that screamed through the night sky like the roar of an angry god, each shell exploding with a violence that shook the earth beneath her boots as Alira stumbled down the rocky slope, dragging the Snipex Alligator along with her, its massive frame gouging lines in the dirt, her body screaming with exhaustion yet refusing to collapse, because she knew that to stop moving now meant being buried under the storm of fire that rained from above, and still her mind clung to clarity, to purpose, to the knowledge that her comrades had made it out because she had stayed behind and fought, and that thought was enough to keep her legs trembling forward even when her lungs burned and her vision swam. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making each breath feel like fire, her ears still ringing from the endless concussions of gunfire and artillery, but she pushed onward, weaving between jagged rocks and broken earth, her body low, her senses sharp in spite of fatigue, knowing the enemy would not simply let her slip away after what she had done, knowing they would send their best to hunt her, to claim the phantom sniper who had shattered their confidence and turned the tide of retreat into survival. Every step echoed with the memory of the recoil, the punishing slam into her shoulder that had become a rhythm of pain, and she could feel the swelling now, the numbness creeping down her arm, but her grip on the Alligator never faltered, for the rifle was no longer just a weapon, it was part of her, fused into her being, the beast she had tamed and the voice of thunder that had carried her name into legend. Somewhere in the distance she heard shouts, the bark of orders, the scrape of boots over stone, and she knew the hunt had begun, knew that squads were fanning out through the darkness with orders to bring her back dead or alive, though she doubted their commanders cared which, and the thought ignited something inside her, not fear but a steady, burning defiance that told her she had not survived this long only to fall like prey in the dirt. She pressed onward, her boots slipping on loose gravel, her breath ragged, until she found herself at the edge of a narrow ravine where the shadows ran deep, and without hesitation she slid into its shelter, her body scraping against the rough stone walls, her weapon clutched tight as she descended into the dark. The world above thundered with fire and fury, but here in the ravine, there was only silence, broken by the distant cries of pursuit and the pounding of her heart. She pressed her back against the cold stone, forcing herself to still her breathing, to let the shadows swallow her, to become once more the ghost they feared, and in that moment she realized the truth. She was no longer fleeing to save herself, she was fighting to prove that the impossible could be done, that a single soldier with will unyielding could turn fear into a weapon sharper than any blade. Her hands trembled as she checked the Alligator, sliding her fingers along the barrel, adjusting the scope, whispering to it like an old friend, because she knew she would need it again soon, that the hunt would not end until one side lay broken in the dirt. The voices grew louder, echoing down into the ravine, beams of light slicing through the dark as enemy soldiers descended in pursuit, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning for movement, their nerves stretched thin by the memory of comrades falling to unseen fire. Alira crouched low, her body pressed into the stone, her mind calm in spite of the fear gnawing at her, waiting, until the first silhouette came into her scope, close enough now that distance no longer mattered, close enough that she could see the glint of sweat on the man's face, the twitch of his nervous fingers against the trigger of his rifle. She inhaled, exhaled, and the Alligator thundered once more, the recoil smashing into her body, the sound roaring through the ravine, the soldier collapsing in a heap before he even knew death had reached him, and chaos erupted as the others shouted, fired blindly into the shadows, their beams of light scattering wildly as fear took hold. Alira moved like smoke, rolling to a new position, her scope finding another silhouette, another heartbeat she would silence, and the rifle bellowed again, its voice echoing off the stone walls like the laughter of gods, another soldier falling, another scream cutting the night. They had thought her broken, thought her fleeing, but here in the shadows she was stronger, sharper, more dangerous than ever, and as their numbers thinned, their courage bled out of them, leaving only terror behind. She felt the weight of exhaustion crushing her, the bruises screaming louder, her arms threatening to fail, but she pushed through because this was more than survival now, This was a battle for her very identity, a fight to prove that the rookie had become something greater, something immortal in the eyes of war. One by one, the hunters became the hunted, their voices fading, their lights extinguished, until at last silence reclaimed the ravine, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing and the faint drip of water from the stone. She lowered the alligator slowly, her arms trembling, her body shaking, and for the first time since the battle began, she allowed herself to collapse against the wall, her head falling back, her eyes closing as exhaustion washed over her like a tide. Yet even in that darkness she smiled faintly, a bitter, tired smile, because she knew she had survived, knew she had carved her mark, knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, her comrades were safe because she had stood and fought, and that was enough. The desert night had settled into a bitter silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind carrying dust across the ravine where the unit had taken shelter. The heat of the day had bled away, leaving the air cold and sharp, a contrast that mirrored the mix of exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through the team. Nadia sat on the edge of a broken wall, her sniper rifle leaning beside her like a loyal companion. The alligator's weight had become familiar to her, almost an extension of her own body, and yet the memory of her last shot still haunted her. How the world had stilled, how the veterans had frozen, and how she had proven herself in a way none of them could deny. But with proof came responsibility, and with responsibility came a new level of danger. She understood this, and it pressed on her shoulders like an invisible burden heavier than the rifle itself. Major Kessler walked past her, his boots crunching against the gravel, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of a field lantern. He paused for a moment, his eyes catching Nadia's. "Get some rest," he said, though his voice carried no real expectation. Nadia gave a small nod but remained where she was, staring out into the black expanse of the desert where the enemy could be moving under cover of night. She wasn't tired, not really. Her body ached, but her mind was sharp, restless, unwilling to surrender to the vulnerability of sleep. Perhaps that was what had changed in her. She wasn't the rookie anymore. Something inside her had hardened, sharpened, and now she felt more alive in moments of risk than in the safety of silence. A faint sound reached her ears then, subtle but distinct, the drag of metal against stone, the click of something deliberate in the distance. She stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the alligator. In the same breath she slid onto her stomach, nestling the rifle against her shoulder, eyes pressed to the scope. Through the green tint of night vision she scanned the horizon. Movement, faint shapes shifting near the ridge, low and cautious, too disciplined to be wildlife. Her breath slowed, her finger resting lightly against the trigger. She whispered into her comms, her voice steady, "Movement northeast ridge approximately 800 meters." The veterans reacted instantly, dropping into positions like a machine fine-tuned by years of combat. What struck Nadia, however, was how none of them second-guessed her call. A week ago they might have hesitated, dismissing her instincts as those of a rookie. Now, after her shot, they listened. It was unspoken, but it was clear. Her voice carried weight. Kessler ordered 2 units to flank the ridge, while Nadia kept her scope trained on the figures. They were slow, precise, carrying themselves with the confidence of trained infiltrators. Whoever they were, they weren't amateurs. She adjusted her breath, calculated wind, distance, the subtle shift of her target's pace. And then, when the shape aligned with the crosshair, she squeezed. The recoil jolted her shoulder, the sound muffled by the suppressor. A split second later, a figure crumpled soundlessly into the sand. The others froze, startled by the invisible death that had struck from the dark. Nadia shifted her aim, already searching for the next. The veterans moved in at the same time, rifles spitting controlled fire, shadows scattering against the ridge. The fight was quick, brutal, and when it was over, silence reclaimed the night. Kessler approached her afterward, crouching beside her with a look that was somewhere between pride and concern. "That shot, clean. You saved us again. But remember, every kill echoes. Someone will notice. Someone always notices." His words stayed with her long after the bodies were cleared, long after the adrenaline faded. She lay awake, staring at the stars above, wondering if this was what her life would become. A cycle of shots that echoed louder than any battlefield, shots that drew eyes she couldn't see, enemies she didn't know. It wasn't fear that filled her, but something colder, sharper, awareness. Every time she pulled the trigger, her legend grew, and with it, the danger of those who might come for her. At dawn, the desert stretched wide and merciless, the sun rising like a blade of fire. The squad moved out, their mission taking them deeper into hostile territory. Nadia marched silently, her rifle slung across her back, her mind replaying every detail of the night. The veterans glanced at her occasionally, their expressions carrying something she hadn't seen before. Respect, yes, but also reliance. She was no longer the youngest, no longer the rookie. In their eyes, she had become something else entirely, someone who could change the tide of battles. But was that what she wanted? She didn't know. She only knew that the weight of the Alligator felt heavier with every step. That evening, as they set up camp in the ruins of an abandoned village, Kessler gathered the squad. His voice was low, grave. Intel confirms we're being tracked. Not just by local forces, by specialists. They've caught wind of what happened 2 nights ago. A sniper capable of a 3,700-meter confirmed kill doesn't stay a secret. They'll want to find you, Nadia. They'll want to test you. The air grew tense and every eye turned toward her. Nadia sat still, her heart steady, her face unreadable. She knew this moment would come. The shot that had defined her was also the shot that had painted a target on her back. Yet instead of shrinking from it, she felt something ignite inside her, a steady, fierce resolve. She met Kessler's gaze and said quietly, "Then let them come. If they want to test me, they'll learn what it means to face someone who doesn't miss." There was no bravado in her tone, only conviction, and that was what unsettled the veterans most. For a moment, silence hung between them, and then Kessler nodded once, a flicker of something like pride crossing his features. The squad dispersed, each soldier processing the weight of her words. Nadia remained where she was, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her hand resting lightly on the Alligator. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that the game had changed. She was no longer just a soldier in their ranks. She was the mark everyone would aim for. And she would be ready. The storm had not ended when dawn began to creep across the horizon, a hazy gray light that turned the drenched earth into a mirror of mud and broken steel. The sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder, but the encampment where Lyra and her team sheltered was eerily quiet, broken only by the whisper of wind through half-collapsed tarps. Sleep had been scarce, fleeting moments stolen between the growl of engines and the phantom screams carried from the battlefield. Lyra sat apart from the others, the Snipex Alligator balanced across her knees, its frame gleaming with fresh oil and the faint scars of use. She ran her fingers along its cold barrel, not with fear or reverence anymore, but with something close to familiarity. Every line of the rifle was etched into her mind, every weight adjustment memorized. This weapon had once terrified her. Now it was as much a part of her as the steady rhythm of her breathing. She could still hear the veteran's words, that mixture of disbelief and awe after her shot had silenced the enemy commander. It had been a turning point, but it was also a burden, for now the commanders did not see her as a rookie to be shielded, they saw her as a weapon to be deployed. And weapons, she knew, were rarely given rest. The briefing came at sunrise, delivered in a hoarse voice by a scarred captain who had fought longer than Lyra had lived. Maps were unrolled across crates, hands pointed at lines of ridges and trenches, and the strategy was spoken not as a choice but as a demand of survival. The enemy had shifted their artillery, concealed it within the jagged ridges 2 kilometers to the east, a position almost untouchable by ground forces without enormous losses. That artillery had already reduced 2 supply convoys to smoking ruins. The captain's finger tapped against the ridge, the sound like nails on a coffin lid, and then his eyes had turned, sharp as blades, toward her. "You put a bullet where no one else dares to breathe. You'll do it again." It wasn't a question. The veterans watched her, some with nods of approval, others with silent doubt, but none with mockery. That had died with her last shot. She swallowed the knot in her throat, not from fear but from the weight of expectation, and gave a simple nod. Words weren't needed. The mission had already been decided the moment her bullet traveled across 3,700 meters and rewrote who she was. They moved before noon, creeping across ravines and mud-slick fields under a sky choked with clouds. Every step was a reminder that silence was survival, the crunch of boots muffled by wet soil, the clink of gear drowned beneath gusts of wind. Lyra carried the Alligator wrapped in camo cloth, its size making her movements slower than the others, but no one rushed her. The veterans had learned something too, that their own survival might very well depend on the strange calm of this young sniper who had done the impossible once before. As they reached the slope of a fractured hill, the captain gave a silent signal, and the squad spread like shadows, finding cover beneath rocks and skeletal trees. From this vantage, the ridge came into view, jagged teeth against the skyline, its crevices veiled in mist. Somewhere in those stone jaws, the enemy's artillery crouched, hidden and deadly. To the naked eye, it was nothing but rock and fog. To Lyra it was a puzzle begging to be solved. She unfolded the bipod, set the Alligator down, and adjusted the scope with patient, meticulous fingers. The world narrowed into a circle of glass, every rock and shadow magnified until they became an entire universe of details. She slowed her breathing, letting her heartbeat find its rhythm with the rifle. The mist shifted, parted slightly, and there, movement, subtle but undeniable. A glint of steel too smooth to be natural. She tracked it, ignored the distractions of wind and drifting cloud, and then another shape revealed itself, the edge of a barrel disguised beneath tarpaulin. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she confirmed the coordinates, her words carried to the squad through a scratchy comms line. The captain didn't hesitate. Take it. Show them why the earth itself should fear a single shot. Her finger brushed the trigger and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the merging of thought and steel. When the shot cracked, it echoed like thunder splitting the heavens, and in her scope she saw chaos blossom. The tarpaulin shredded, the artillery piece lurched, and enemy soldiers scrambled like ants in the open. Before the echo even died, she was reloading, cycling the bolt with precision that surprised even her. The veterans opened fire then, seizing the chaos her shot had created. Bullets rained across the ridge, pinning down soldiers who had thought themselves untouchable. Explosions thundered as grenades found their mark, and shouts of panic rolled across the valley. Yet even as the squad pressed the assault, Lyra remained locked in her world of glass and steel. Her second shot tore through the chest of a gunner attempting to steady the artillery, sending him sprawling. Her third shattered the scope of an enemy marksman who had tried to fix her position. Each bullet was a declaration. She was not luck, she was not accident, she was inevitability. And yet, with each squeeze of the trigger, a piece of her humanity seemed to slip further into silence. She did not flinch, did not rejoice, she simply became the rhythm of war, steady and unrelenting. The enemy's return fire was furious. Mortars thumped, shells screeched across the valley, and dirt erupted in showers that rained across her prone form. Rocks shattered around her, shards cutting her cheek, but she did not move. The alligator's weight anchored her to the earth, and her focus was a shield stronger than any armor. The veterans shouted, cursed, and ducked behind cover, yet still glanced toward her, as though reassured by the calm of her presence. One shell landed too close, sending shockwaves through her body, ears ringing, vision blurring for a moment. But she blinked it away, exhaled, and fired again, the shot cracking through the ringing like a note of defiance. When the smoke finally began to thin, the ridge was silent except for the distant groans of the wounded. The artillery lay ruined, blackened husks of steel, and the squad began to retreat down the slope before reinforcements could swarm. They returned to camp as dusk painted the horizon in shades of fire and ash. The captain clapped her shoulder, a rare gesture of approval that carried more weight than any medal. "You're not just one of us," he said quietly so the others would not hear. "You're what keeps us alive." Lyra didn't answer. She couldn't. For even as pride stirred faintly in her chest, it was swallowed by the ache in her soul. She could still see their faces in her scope, fleeting glimpses of men before the bullet found them, lives erased with the pull of her finger. The others celebrated in their rough, weary way, sharing stolen bottles and whispered laughter, but she remained apart, her eyes fixed on the dark line of the horizon. The alligator rested against the wall beside her, silent, patient, like a beast waiting for its next command. That night, when the camp finally quieted, she sat alone beneath a tattered canvas, the weight of silence pressing harder than any enemy fire. She thought of the girl she had been before, clumsy with her rifle, mocked for her mistakes, dreaming of proving herself one day. That girl seemed like a ghost now, someone who had died the moment the bullet flew across 3,700 meters. What remained was someone else, someone colder, someone carved into existence by war. And yet, beneath that coldness, a small flicker of fear still lived, not of dying, not of failing, but of what she was becoming. Would there be anything left of her when the war finally ended, or would she be nothing more than the echo of her shots, a legend spoken with awe but never truly understood? She closed her eyes trying to find sleep, but all she saw was the crosshair, steady and eternal, waiting for her to look through it once more. The courtroom erupted in stunned silence after the judge's final words echoed across the grand chamber. Karen's face drained of color, her lips trembling as if she still couldn't process what had just happened. For months she had bullied, harassed, and schemed, convinced she could bend the law and the neighborhood to her will. But in one decisive ruling, the empire she built on arrogance collapsed. The judge not only dismissed her lawsuit but ordered her personally liable for damages, legal costs, and restitution to every resident she had exploited under her fraudulent HOA. The crowd that filled the gallery, neighbors, veterans, friends, and even curious locals, burst into applause. Some cheered, others whistled, and a few even wept with joy. My father sat motionless for a moment, his military posture unshaken, but a faint smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. He was a man who had faced wars, command decisions, and life-or-death moments, but even he seemed moved by the magnitude of this victory. Karen, on the other hand, tried to stand, clutching her expensive purse like it was a lifeline. She attempted to shout, her voice cracking as she raved about conspiracies, corruption, and favoritism. But the judge had heard enough. "Remove her from my courtroom," he ordered calmly. 2 bailiffs stepped forward, guiding her toward the exit as she kicked and screamed. The image of her once proud, self-appointed reign ending in disgrace was almost poetic,